How much crit is too much? Should you level 90 your characters? Who needs it? And who can get away with way lower? Does meta matter in Genshin? And what are the most underrated weapons in the game? All these questions are gonna be answered and more. You asked for it. Let's talk about 20 must-know things that nobody tells you. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Just realized I'm blocking right in face. That is super annoying. These questions all came from a community post that I did. If I didn't get to your question, it's probably because someone else answered it already, or there's a video that I already made on the topic. But if you have a question that I didn't get to here, look out for my community post and make sure you subscribe so I can get to it next time. But starting off with the number one question that I see all the time, what is my level up priority? Who needs level 90 and who can use lower level? And if you already know, feel free to skip this question. I know some people think that it's super basic and you just say, oh, it's just the transformative reactions, or oh, it's electro reactions with dendro, or oh, it's animo, or it's just this. And the reality is most people have no idea what you're talking about when they say transformative reactions. So I'm going to go through it, and by the end you will know. So if you're still confused, get ready to be confused no longer. Transformative reactions, when people say that, are certain reactions that scale off of level, whereas other reactions don't scale off of level in the same way. The first characters that do this are animo characters. So any character that does good damage based off of swirl, such as Sucrose, Kazuha, Venti, they should be prioritized and taken to level 90. That is your number one priority. Similarly, any characters doing dendro reactions should be taken to level 90. For both swirl and for dendro related reactions, it's about a 30% increase just to go from level 80 to level 90. And these reactions often contribute to a huge portion of the team's damage, so it's really worth it. Now, when I say a character that's involved with the reaction, that's generally a character that's triggering the reaction. So animo characters trigger a swirl, Alhaitham triggers a spread, Nilou triggers blooms, and she also amplifies blooms. So let's go through. The next characters you want to consider are ones that don't scale off of base attack, because these characters get no base attack from their weapon, so their level matters more relative to characters that do scale with their weapon. So characters like Yelan, to some degree Hu Tao, but not quite as much, because she still does scale with base attack to a degree. But characters like Yelan are also really high value for level 90. But characters that you want to consider level 90 are hyper carry characters. So those are characters that do a very high percentage of the team's damage. So someone like Wanderer is going to have better scalings from going to level 90 than someone like Xingqiu, unless you're using Xingqiu in a Nilou Bloom team where he's proccing some of the blooms. I would prioritize someone like Wanderer above someone like Xiangling or someone like Xingqiu. Again, but maybe you're using Xiangling and she's proccing some Burgeons because you're using her with Nahida, so you definitely do want to get her to level 90 in that case. Characters like Fischl, again, that's an aggravate type character doing dendro reactions, so you'll definitely want to do level 90. Same with Sino. Raiden, if you're using her in a national team, you can stop at level 80. If you're using her in a hyper team, probably level 90 is a good idea, and definitely if you're using her in a hyper bloom team. Kokomi doesn't need it unless you're again in a dendro team proccing blooms. Razor definitely needs it because he's proccing Burgeons. Same with Toma if he's proccing Burgeons, but if he's shield bot, you don't need it. Hopefully you're starting to get the idea. If it's not making sense, comment in the comments and we can help you out even more. Feel free to join our Discord for help as well. In terms of characters that can get away with a way lower level, I've left characters like my Kale at a level 70. In pretty much all cases, you definitely need at least level 60 because their 4th Ascension passive comes from there. And I find going from 60 to 70 so cheap that I like to go to 70 regardless. But for someone like Kale, because I only use her in aggravate teams and her personal damage doesn't matter that much, she's just applying that element, I can get away with level 70. And I get away with level 80 on a lot of characters that don't do a huge portion of the team's damage, like Kaya, Chongyun, Layla, Diona, or even characters that I'm just haven't gotten around to the resources yet, like Shenhe or Dia or Linny. They're perfectly functional at level 80, and it's not until you really want to maximize them that you want to take them to level 90. Characters like Lynette, I'll probably keep at level 80 forever, since she doesn't do a lot of swirl damage, she does mostly animo damage. And characters like Chi-Chi really could probably stay at level 70 because she does so much healing at level 70 that you really don't need those extra levels. Whew, hopefully that finally takes care of that question. What what talents are worth crowning? This is a pretty interesting one in my opinion, and I think the answer is it relates to the percentage of the team damage that character does. So for a character like Bennett, it probably is worth it to crown just because you get that additional bonus. Probably gives like a 2-3% team DPS increase, which can be relevant. But someone like Wanderer, if you're gonna main Wanderer, you just might as well crown him. He does such a high percentage of the team, something like 90% of the team damage, that crowning is really important. Same with Raiden. She doesn't do quite as much as 90%, but she does something like 70 to 80% of the team's damage if you're using her with C6 Kujosara. So crowning her burst is going to be a really big increase. But for someone like Al-Haytham, he does a lot of his damage through spreads and reactions, so you don't want to crown him, at least not as a priority, because it's not only the percentage that they do, but also how much that talent multiplier does. And so generally raw damage is more important to crown than a reaction damage. So although it can be very worth to crown Hu Tao, it's not as much of a necessity as someone like Zhao. And obviously for someone like Nilou, she barely uses her talents at all, so you can leave her at 111. And for characters in the middle, such as Yelan, who don't do like 90 or 80% of their team's damage, but you still do a lot of damage with them all the time, I think it's not really a matter of if, but a matter of when it's worth it. Because if you're going through your account and you haven't yet farmed out proper artifacts for Yelan, you definitely don't want to be crowning her. Same with if you're not done talents for your other characters, you're not done artifacts for other characters, it's more of something luxury. Same with Ayato, he's more reaction focused, less talent focused. But someone like Ayaka, you do want to consider crowning eventually after you have the good characters. If you want a more detailed analysis of this, I do go through this in my ultimate team building guide, so definitely check that out. Explain the stats of Genshin. Too much crit. What does elemental mastery do? How much should you have? What does defense and flat defense do? So the first question was, when do you have too much crit rate? A lot of people say, oh, when you get to 90% of crit rate, it's diminishing returns compared to going to 100%. Well, that's actually not true. Anything less, you don't get diminishing returns from crit rate until you get past 100%. Crit rate is very useful. The way you want to think of stats in Genshin is by that common old math problem where you have a certain amount of fence and you want to get the largest area by your fence possible. And the way you do that is by balancing. You want to have a pretty much equal amount here and an equal amount here to get the largest surface area. So if you think this is crit rate and crit damage, the closer your crit rate and crit damage are equal to in value, the more surface area you have and the more damage you'll do. So that's what's called the 1-to-2 ratio, is you want approximately half as much crit rate as you have crit damage. So if you have 70 crit rate, you generally want around 140 crit damage. You have 100 crit rate, you want 200 crit damage, etc. Of course, the most important thing is not having them equal. You want to have the most value possible. But if you end up with way more crit damage than your crit rate, like if you have 250% crit damage and only 50% crit rate, every other hit is going to be hitting for 0 crit damage. So the more crit damage you have, the more important it is to have more crit rate, because all that juicy crit damage, if you don't crit, is doing nothing. The 17% of the time that my Wanderer misses his crit, this 200 crit damage does not matter at all. So it would be better for me to gain 7% crit and lose 15% crit damage, because then I'm only going to be missing the crit 20% of the time instead of 27% of the time. Even when you get to 90% crit rate, 10% of the time you miss on all of your 200 crit damage. So you definitely don't want to neglect crit rate until if you have over 200 crit damage, you would rather be bringing up your crit rate. I saw a classic misconception in the comments where they were saying that Ayaka wants less than 45% crit rate, and it's kind of true because you don't want to overcap, but I'd rather overcap, and then sometimes when my enemies aren't frozen, I'm still critting, than stacking this crit damage even higher to something like 270 crit damage and 30 crit rate. You're going to be getting a lot of that crit damage wasted by not having 100% crit rate. What does elemental mastery do? How much do I need? Elemental mastery is a reaction multiplier for certain reactions. So vaporize, aggravate, electrocharge, swirl. Elemental mastery is another type of reaction multiplier similar to crit rate or crit damage. It's a stat that's completely useless on certain characters like Wanderer, who doesn't really get any damage from his swirls at all, and it's his raw talent damage, but is a very important character for a very important stat for characters like Xiangling, who do a ton of damage through vaporizing their hits. And same with someone like Hu Tao. So how much is enough? How much is too much? The basic answer is if you want to have at least 150, and that's where I would start as a minimum, and there's really never any diminishing returns. Eventually there is, but mostly the diminishing returns come from if getting too much elemental mastery reduces the amount of crit stats that you can have, then that won't be worth it. But my Xiangling having 340 elemental mastery is really good as long as I'm not losing all of my crit rate to do so. It also highly depends on how many buffs on your team are getting elemental mastery. If you're using Kaching in Aggravate, for example, it's good to have a lot of elemental mastery, but you don't need quite as much if your Nahida is giving the on-fielder a ton of EM from her buff. The moral of the story is good stats are good stats. So if you're a character that uses EM, getting EM in your artifacts is really, really good. For a character like Hu Tao, if you have an EM weapon, you generally can go for an HP Sands, but if you're not using an EM weapon, you almost always want to be using an HP Sands because you won't have enough elemental mastery otherwise. Do not ever have less than 100 on vaporized characters. What does defense and flat defense do? It's basically part of the calculation of when the enemy does damage to you, and it determines how much HP is taken away. So a character with high defense like Ito will have less HP taken away from the same hit to someone with low defense like Linny. The other thing that defense and flat defense do is that they ruin your artifact rolls. What are some low investment teams for Abyss? If I were to choose 2 low investment teams for Abyss, I guess I'll look at both Primogem investment as well as artifact investment. For artifact investment, I'd say that Nilou has to be one of the lowest investment teams for the Abyss. You just need full HP on Nilou, whatever works on Nahida, usually damage, full EM on Barbara, and then maybe instructors on Kirara or something like that. It's a very, very low investment team. You do need 3 level 90 characters, but it's so little artifact investment that it's kind of insane, and it will carry you through all Abysses that don't have like cryo shields or Dendromium enemies. The national team, especially Sucrose National, is a really low investment in terms of 5 stars because it's a 4-star only team. The tricky thing about this is that every person's account is different. So what's low investment to you should be based on your account, and it can be really hard to tell. But I think Aggravate is probably another good choice. Lisa, Fischl, Kirara, and Sucrose. And then some kind of Hyperbloom team is probably a great choice as well. These 4 kind of come to mind as relatively low investment teams in both senses of the word. For 4-star only teams with no constellations, that sounds like fun. So if we take this for one side, no constellations, hey? This question has an inherent problem to me because the 4 stars that everyone will get are very different. So you might have a C6 Xingqiu, whereas someone else might not have any. You might have a C1 Zhengling, whereas someone else might have a C6. If you're doing a 4-star only team with no constellations, you're going to need to compensate for that lack of constellations with some good artifacts. And you're going to need good artifacts anyways to full star the Spiral Abyss. So by the time you're able to full star the Abyss with 4-star characters, you're almost definitely, unless you have extreme game knowledge, you're almost definitely going to have multiple 5 stars and multiple constellations on a lot of 4-star characters. So I don't think this is a very useful topic because the free-to-play experience is not 4 stars with no constellations. The free-to-play experience is a smattering of 4 stars with varying constellation levels, and a smattering of 5 stars with various constellation levels, and a smattering of 5-star weapons, maybe or not. So that's really it's too hard to answer, and it's also not very useful to answer in my opinion. Abyss with non-meta characters. Unlike what people say, the Abyss is actually pretty hard. Yes, it's easy if you use meta characters that are well built and you know how to play the game, but if we look at non-meta characters, right, you can't just slap Sayu, Kale, Diona, and Dia into a team and expect that to clear Abyss. You have to have a really good understanding of how Genshin Impact works to make these characters work. So for example, if I'm going to build an Abyss team with Sayu, I'm going to have to use meta units to do it, but I'm still going to be able to. So I'm going to take someone like Fischl because Sayu is an on-field animal unit, so she can do something which is aggravate. So she can aggravate on field. That's probably the strongest thing that she can do for damage. So I'm going to go Sayu, Fischl for those aggravates. I can do something like Kale actually because she can off-field trigger those Dendro reactions. And then I'm going to personally add in something like Sucrose or something like Kazuha. We'll just go with Kazuha for the grouping, for the stronger grouping. And this is the kind of team that I would use for a non-meta unit like Sayu to clear the Abyss. We're going to use the game knowledge we have for powerful reactions. Maybe I'll make an entire video on this. Let me know if you'd like to see me make a video on how to make all the non-meta characters into good teams. But that's what you're going to do. You're going to abuse your game knowledge and abuse meta units to make your non-meta units work. What is the most fun and or brain dead team? Mine is Raiden for sure. That's my most fun team. I love that you can't get interrupted or staggered because I'm very skill issue. Hyperbloom is probably the most brain dead team, especially if you're even just with Xingqiu Kuki. You have to make sure that your Kuki doesn't die, but other than that, it's pretty brain dead. You can use Raiden, Yelan, Nahida, and Zhongli, and that's really brain dead. Also, Nilou is one of my favorite fun teams. I personally find Hu Tao fun. I know a lot of people don't. So yeah, for me, Raiden and Nilou for my most fun teams, and Hyperbloom and Nilou for my most brain dead teams. How do you construct rotations for fun teams? Great question. Let's say we made this team. The way you construct rotations for fun teams is the same way you construct rotations for any team. And I will talk about this in my ultimate team building guide, but there's basically two things you want to look at. One is your skill and burst cooldowns. And the second is thinking about the kind of reactions that you're trying to do. And third, actually, there's a third one, is the kind of energy management that the team will have to have as well. So for example, when you're using a team with Raiden, you look at her skill cooldown. Its duration is 25 seconds. 25 seconds is a really long time. Most rotations are somewhere between 18 and 22 seconds. So a 25-second duration, you're almost always going to open any rotation where you're using Raiden with her skill. When we look at her burst, we can see that it has a duration of 7 seconds. There's something called hit lag. Don't worry about it. It makes her actual on-field duration about 9 seconds. And her cooldown is 18 seconds. So in an ideal world, we actually have an 18-second rotation for Raiden. More than likely, it's going to be closer to 20. But by looking at these cooldowns, we can tell that we're going to start with her skill, and at some point, we're going to use our other characters' rotations. So if we're using Raiden National, let's say, we've got Xingqiu with a 21-second cooldown on his skill and a 20-second cooldown on his burst. So we know the rotation will be at least 20 seconds. We can see the duration of his skill cooldown is longer than his burst. We want to use his skill cooldown first. In fact, it might even be a 21-second cooldown unless you're using Sacrificial Sword. But because his cooldown is so long, we probably want to be using him at the start of the rotation, because Zhang Ling's cooldown, well, it's actually also 20 seconds and Bennett's is 15 seconds. So we want to make sure that we use Bennett after we use Xingqiu, or else Bennett will expire first. So we start with, so that's where we get the rotation from. We start with Xingqiu's burst because it lasts the longest. It doesn't need Bennett to snapshot. Then we use Bennett because Zhang Ling needs to snapshot Bennett's buff, and then we go into a Raiden. So the whole rotation for Raiden National is start with skill, then use his burst, then use his burst, then skill, into her burst, and now we're laughing. And if we use a non-meta team, we can do the same thing. So whoever asked this question, hopefully that was helpful. I know that's a rotation that everyone knows, but hopefully that describes how that rotation came to be so that you can apply that to yours. We're going to cover this more in a dedicated video on team building. How do you decide which artifacts go into the strong box, especially when considering unreleased characters? It's a balance, because we don't know what Hoyoverse is going to do in the future, but what I try and do is to keep artifacts that I think that have synergy. If I know that they don't have synergy with characters in the game, I try and think about if they have synergy with that artifact set. So if I got an HP Sands, for example, on this set, obviously this one has two crit substats, so I would keep this anyway, but let's say it only had one. How do I know whether I'd throw that or keep it? Well, because this is a Hydro bonus set, I could definitely see a Hydro bonus HP being good, because HP often has synergy with Hydro. Whereas if this was a defense Sands, and I already had a bunch of defense Sands on my account, so far we haven't seen a defense character scale with Hydro, and it seems weird to me. I don't think that they would do that. I think that if they make a Hydro character, it's going to scale with HP. So I'm not going to keep, a defense Sands or maybe a defense Circlet. I'm not going to keep that, but I would keep maybe if I had an HP Circlet with 2 crit rolls, I might keep that, because who knows, that might be good in the future. Let's go through. I keep a lot of pieces. So, why did I keep this? Well, attack goblet. Sometimes characters have so much elemental damage bonus that I'll keep the occasional attack goblet with double crit. I kept this animo damage bonus goblet, even though it doesn't have crit. Maybe the last one rolls crit and every other roll rolls into crit. So if I'm desperate for an onset animo damage bonus, that's why I'll keep this. Geo damage bonus. I basically keep any elemental damage bonus with at least 1 crit. EM, I often will keep, even if this is not the animo set, until you have like 3 or 4 EM pieces for each goblet, Sands, and Circlet. I'll keep at least 1, even if it's offset. EM Sands, pretty obvious. I like to keep energy recharge Sands of supportive sets, because energy recharge is a very, very valuable stat. So even though an energy recharge with no good substats is kind of scuffed, I'd rather keep this just in case I need another energy recharge VV set. So for example, my Faruzan needed one, and now Lynette, lo and behold, also can use it as well. You're not always going to run those characters on VV, but you get the idea. The other thing I look for is when the substats have synergy with each other. So I kept this piece because attack, EM, and crit rate all kind of go together. But I'm not going to keep this piece because crit rate Circlet doesn't really have synergy with the set. Of course, if it had crit damage here, I would roll it to see how it goes, but I'm not going to waste my time with something that almost definitely won't work out. Your standards will also differ depending on how new a set is for you. So like this piece, I'm willing to totally roll this because I don't have too many great feathers right now, but as soon as I get 1 or 2, I'm probably going to not roll. Like, let's see, if I already have, let's say I already have 2 good feathers of this, I'm either going to look for 2 or 3 good substats for me to roll it, depending on how good good quality my other pieces are. So at this point, I already have 2 good Thundering Fury plumes. So let's just imagine these are Thundering Fury. I wouldn't keep this because my Thundering Fury characters don't really need, well, actually I would. My Sino needs more ER. So I might keep this and roll this. I would definitely keep this and roll this. I probably wouldn't keep this and roll this just because attack isn't as valuable for those characters. I probably wouldn't keep this and roll this. But if I was brand new to filling a Thundering Fury set, I would keep these 2 because attack is, although not being optimal for aggravate, is still good. In Gilded Dreams, I'm keeping this because it's a 4-line start with EM. I may want to run full EM, and this might roll a lot into EM, so that'd be good. Same with this piece. I have this one locked, but I shouldn't. This one's no good. So far, we haven't had any Dendro characters that scale really heavily with HP. I'm not really expecting it. I'm keeping this because attack circlets can sometimes be good if they roll really well. For some reason, I'm keeping this just as cope. I'm locking totally different sets for this one because I'm looking for ER and HP substats. So ER and EM, ER and EM, HP, EM. Hopefully this gives you at least some insight into how it really does depend on your account, but hopefully that at least gives you some insight on the process. How does particle generation work? I won't go through the exact numbers here, but the on-field character gets the full particles and it's multiplied by their energy recharge. The off-field characters get around half the particles, a bit more. If they're the same element or if they're white particles, they get less of that energy if they're not of the same element. So when I use Chongyun's skill, Shenhe is going to get less particles than Chongyun because she's off-field, but more than Kokomi because she's a different element. And you can do something called funneling. So if I use Shenhe's skill and then I switch to Chongyun, he'll catch the most particles and Shenhe will be the one getting less. I could even funnel from Shenhe into Kokomi, but it won't be as effective because she's funneling cryo particles into a hydro character, so she'll get a reduced amount of particles. And each of them, whenever they catch particles, having more ER is going to get them more value for those particles to fill up their burst. Does meta matter in Genshin? Is meta fun? For me, meta is really fun. It's fun for 2 reasons. One is that I can make funky things like this, like DPS Shenhe, work if I understand meta and how strong characters amplify other characters. I love having Kazuha because he makes so many other characters viable. I know some people don't like how many teams use Kazuha, but I love that my Kazuha can make my Yoimiya or my Hu Tao or my Sino do more damage because I like those characters. Even if I don't love Kazuha, I like that he can make my Shenhe and my Ayaka do better. So I think meta is fun in that way, in that it can magnify your favorite characters. You use your characters with their meta teams to magnify them and have the most fun with them possible. I also personally do find it fun to think about who's the best. I don't know why. I was the kind of kid that liked to race Hot Wheels on a race car track to see which one would finish first, to have marble tournaments and race them down the things to see which marble was the fastest and which marble would win the tournament. Like, I find that fun. Sometimes it's just as exciting as who's going to win the Stanley Cup or the Super Bowl or the FIFA World Cup. And so for me, it is fun to, that's why I started my channel, was to build and test every character, to have fun with the different characters and also to see who was strong and who was weak and who was better or worse. Not because, you know, I like to judge which characters are better and worse, but because I find it fun to rank them on a tier list. I just personally find it fun. If you don't find it fun, that's totally fine. But I like it for both of those reasons, to magnify your favorites and to just see who's the best, because I enjoy that. Now, does it matter in the sense that do you have to use meta to clear the abyss? I think you have to use good synergies, and that could be considered meta, right? You can't just throw random characters together and think that that will work out for you. You do have to use kind of meta strategies or strategies that are successful, but you don't have to only use the best characters to clear the game. And I think that that's what's so great about Genshin. If you have any other questions, keep an eye for our community posts. Feel free to join the Discord. Leave other questions in the comments. If you've been enjoying the video, please consider subscribing. If you want to become a member of the channel, we've got cool new emojis and other perks. You can check out my Patreon as well to support me. You can check out our Discord, as I mentioned. And if you don't want to do any of those things, that is totally fine. Just watching the video has been more than enough. Thanks so much. Bye for now.